The Stylized Asset Suite add-on lets you create amazing stylized shaders and animations without ever having to use or know anything about nodes. It's a completely visual system with all effects being animatable, and additionally this add-on allows you to very easily bake and export the shaders you make in a few clicks so that you can use them in other softwares even if they're animated. You also get access to 23 custom-made brushes for painting and a texture pack for using with the effects if you want. I know this video is very long, but it's basically the documentation for the add-on, and you can refer to the timestamps for more in-depth info on what each effect does. So you can use this video as kind of a reference while you're using the add-on. There's really not much of a learning curve with this add-on though. It's very easy to understand, as you're about to see. So let's get into it. Alright guys, so after you've installed the add-on, and if you hit N, you can see in the N panel on the right hand side we have this Stylized Asset Suite, or Stylized Asset Builder, whatever I decided to call it in the end. And you can just click on it, and you can drag this out, this menu a bit, because there are a lot of options, and we want to make sure that we can see all of them well. So I'm going to hit A to just delete all the objects in the scene. You don't have to do that. Obviously you can have whatever objects you want in the scene, but just for the sake of this tutorial showing you how to use the add-on, we're just going to focus on just texturing some regular objects. So I'm going to add a UV sphere, and if we go to the rendered mode, I'm in Eevee by the way. I'll be doing this tutorial in Eevee because Cycles is just very laggy. But basically, with this menu here, the Stylized Asset Suite menu, we can hit this new button up here, and what that does is it's going to create a new shader or material or whatever you want to call it for our object. So as you can see, now it's blue. Just one thing I want to say here, you guys might notice the colors in the scene slightly change in value. That's because the add-on switched the view transform to be standard, whereas before I think it was like AGX. I recommend using standard view transform. It'll just make things like painting with brushes and stuff like that a lot more consistent. If you want, you can switch it back to whatever view transform you were using before, but I highly recommend you just use standard. If you don't see this information under base color, when you first install the add-on, it's important to hit this refresh drop-down menus button. And basically, if you guys are having any issues with seeing items in drop-down menus or like anything's like messed up, just hit the refresh drop-down menus button and it'll fix it. So let me just talk to you a little bit about this base color effect down here and what it does. So it's very self-explanatory. You can just choose a base color, and then if you want to import a base color for, like, if you already made like a model or something and you have a base color that you want to use, you can hit open here, select the image texture, and then after that you can use the enable base color map and it'll use it. If you want different faces of your model to use a different shader, that's very easy as well. If you add a material slot, hit new again, and maybe we'll make this one like red. If you go into edit mode, you can select whatever faces you want and hit assign material. And yeah. Before going over what everything at the top here does, I want to start off by showing you what this build your stylized shader part of the menu does. So basically down here we have this, if I pull this out more, you can see select effect to add, and basically you can select here from all these different effects that you can add if you want. So let's just say first I want to add some lighting. This Stylized 3D lighting main dynamic Eevee, this is the main lighting that you're going to be using a lot of the time to do like your main lighting and all that. So if we select it, obviously you can see select effect to add is set to this effect that we chose. You can hit add effect, and as you can see, if you wait for it to compute for a second, you can see now we have this other part of our menu that's appeared. And basically the way this menu works is as you add these effects, they sort of stack on top of each other. And if you scroll down even more, you can see there's a swapping menu and a duplication menu, but we'll get to that later. So let's just focus on this effect that we just added. As you can see, nothing has changed so far, and the reason why is because the Stylized 3D lighting main effect, it uses the sun objects and the point light objects that are just native to Blender. So if I add like a sun, for example, now we have some light, so I can rotate the sun around, and we have to shade this object smooth. So I'm just going to click it, hit shade smooth. Now we have all these options here too. The most important option is probably this light slider, which will allow us to slide the general distance of the light. And then there's this tune steps feature too, which allows you to have like multiple steps of the lighting. As you can see, the more steps we add, the more it becomes like just a normal lighting situation with no tune shading whatsoever. And one thing I want to say is this light slider slash controller and this tune steps effect are very interlinked, in the sense that oftentimes you might have an issue where you're increasing the tune steps, but then you have a problem where some of the dark lighting is like going off of the model. But all of that is very easy to fix because this light slider slash controller will allow you to reel it in and just completely customize it as you like. Also, there's this darken edge feature over here. If you decrease it, what you can see it does is it adds a dark edge between the bright and the dark value. So as you can see, you can use the distance as well to slide it a bit. I might have to type in a specific value. But yeah, you could use that if you want. Works better if you're only using like 2 colors. Like if we have steps at 1, this is when it'll work best. If you use like a lot of steps, it won't work as well, as you can see. But yeah. And I should also say this blend style up here, you can kind of ignore smooth step and smoother step because I don't really use them, but if you look at this linear option here, what that does is it'll make the lighting so that it no longer uses this tune steps thing, and the lighting is just kind of like how normal lighting works in Blender, right? So as you can see, if I rotate it around, it's just like a normal CG type of lighting with no tune shading. And you can still use the light slider as well. Alright guys, also for the Stylized light effect, there's this painterly effect too here, which is really awesome. So I recommend switching it to linear if you're going to use it. So I'll switch to linear here. And I'm going to decrease the shadow value a bit as well. So basically, if we enable the painterly effect, I'm going to set it to like 1. You can see now we get these kind of hatches forming on our model. These like painterly type of hashes. And so what you could do with them is you can change the scale. You can change the distortion of it if you want to distort it. And there's another distort as well right here. So you can play around with that. And we have smooth strokes, so you can smooth it however much you want. Then we have strokes contrast, which usually I like to bring up smooth strokes to like 0.7, then increase the contrast as well, so that we get something that's nice and painterly. As you can see on Suzanne here as well, the painterly effect is there. If you zoom in, you can see it pretty nicely. So yeah, you're just going to want to play around with it a lot. You can change the scale. All these features can easily be changed. And then over here we have the strokes map, which by default it's enabled to one of the stylized textures that comes with this add-on, but if you want to use something else, you can hit the X and then wait for it to load. You can choose any of these textures, or you can download something from the internet and use that as well. So I don't know, maybe if I click like this, you can see now we got a new texture. Alright, anyways, I set it back to what it was before now. And so yeah, I hope you understand like just how versatile this effect can be. Like literally any object you have, you can use this painterly shader with, and you can get these nice strokes immediately, completely customizable. And yeah, one caveat with this painterly shader effect though, if you want to bake it, there's a slight chance that it could mess up. Sometimes it has for me. In the case of that happening either way though, what you could do is you could use the bake normals feature that I added, and that'll allow you to bake the painterly normals that basically this effect makes, and just use that as the normal map in like another software maybe if you want to export it. But yeah, usually it works for me, just sometimes it does mess up though. And we'll see later how we can combine it with the specular reflection effect to get even more variation with this. So I'm going to switch it back to step linear because I think it looks a bit cooler. But yeah, so we can slide this to wherever we want. Now if you look here, we have highlight setting. Light value by default was set to 3, and 1 is the default, which means if we're at 1, you can see there's no difference than what the base color was previously, right? So you can set this light value to whatever you want. You can even set it to be something negative. If you see here when I scroll, it doesn't let me scroll past 2. I don't know why it's like that, but basically if you want to get a value above 2, all you have to do is just click this, then type in whatever you want. So if you want the value to be like 10, then as you can see now it's something very bright. And so I'm going to put it back to 3 for now though. If you look at this colorized highlight feature, we can choose a color that we want the light to be. So maybe if I want it to be something warm, I can choose like an orange. And then if you increase this colorized highlight influence, you can see now it's making the light a more orange color. Similarly, the shadow value works the same way. This is going to be the parts that are not in the light, and you can just decrease the shadow value to be as dark as you want. And also the colorized shadow works the same way as well. Maybe if we put this like a dark yellow color, you can see you could easily colorize it. Now if you scroll down here, there's bump settings. I might have renamed it to distort settings by the time this add-on is released. But yes, basically what it does is it distorts the lighting. So as you can see, this noise/Voronoi switch, it's hard to really explain, but if you just play around with it, it's kind of like a different style of distortion. Scale, well, just obviously the scale of it. If you use like a really small scale, like 3 or 2 or 1, as you can see, it's becoming a lot more not as grainy as it was before. So yeah, so I'm going to set this to like 2 for now. Then we have scale down here again, and this scale up here was uniform, meaning it scales the X, Y, and Z axes all at once. But this scale, you can have it individual, right? So as you can see here, you can just play around with these scale values and scale it however you want. So I'm going to set that back to 1. Obviously you have rotation, location as well. This would be a fun thing to animate, to be honest. Remember that all of the parameters that you see are animatable. We have detail as well, roughness, which roughness and detail are kind of interlinked. And then we have this object coordinate setting here, as well as this UV coordinate. So by default, it's set to object coordinates, but if you want to use UV instead, and this is for the bump, by the way. So if you're not using a bump, you don't have to worry about this at all, but basically the difference is that object coordinates are basically just generated by Blender for the object, and it doesn't take into account any seams or anything like that, whereas UV coordinates obviously is if you have your model unwrapped, then, which this one is by default because it's just a UV sphere. If we go to the UV editing tab, you can see that it is unwrapped. So if we use UV coordinates instead and we bump, it's going to just be based on that rather than being based on the object coordinates. And that was why before, if I go back to object coordinate, there was this, it's hard to see there, but let me just try and replicate the issue. As you can see here, it has this kind of weird circular thing on the side, almost like a ripple, and that was because of the object coordinates. So yeah, so the next option, normal map. If you're familiar with how normal maps work, I mean, that's very straightforward. You can just open up whatever your normal map that you have for this object is and apply it here. But another great way to use this is, I'm just going to turn off bump, and if we open up one of the textures that comes with this add-on, or you can just make your own texture. So if I just hit the open button, as you can see here, you can click on the Stylized textures pack that comes with this add-on, and you can select anything here. So, for example, maybe let's check this one. You can see nothing's happened yet because we have to drag this enable normal map feature. So if you add in a normal map, remember you have to enable it with this feature here. As you can see, it's messed everything up, but that's because the strength is set to 1 over here. So if I just decrease it a bit, as you can see, we're now using that image texture that we imported as the normal map. So yeah, and obviously for this normal map, you can change around the location, the rotation, and the scale, and all of that. And so yeah, as you can see, I highly recommend increasing the scale value. Maybe if we do like 3, I'm going to hit Control-C to copy this value here. Just paste them here. As you can see, now we have something that's very nice and refined, and once again, you can adjust the strength. Okay, that's pretty much it for this main stylized 3D lighting node. Obviously, you can add point lights and stuff as well, and they will also show up in your lighting. So yeah, that's basically how it works. It's based on the Blender lights. Okay, now that that's done, I forgot to tell you, you also have this visibility slider up here, and you can slide how visible you want this layer to be. That being done, if we go up here and we look at this viewing option over here, you can see right now it says show all items. So if we select something here, we can see that it'll collapse all the other effects and it'll just show the one that is currently selected. So if I select base color, as you can see, it shows base color only and it collapses the light. And if I show light, then it'll collapse the base color. So yeah, that's the viewing. Just in case your effect layers get like really long, it's good to just be viewing one at a time. So these effects are all dynamic. You can change the base color and everything will update. Really cool. So the next effect I want to go over is the local gradient effect. So yeah, for this local gradient effect, we can click it and then we can hit add here. And what you'll notice immediately for the local gradient rectangular is we get this empty that appears all of a sudden. And what this is basically the thing that's going to control our gradient. Now this is extremely easy to use. If I just move the empty around, like if I move it down, you can see the gradient starts to come into place. And that's because the way the gradient rectangular works is you can imagine it as like sort of just this giant rectangle that we're pulling down on our model. And not necessarily down as well, because with this empty you can rotate it as well and it'll update on our model. You can scale it and you can do all these cool operations with it. So like if I rotate it this way, for example, you can see now if I move it like this, that rectangle that I was talking about, you can imagine it like this. Or like technically it goes on until infinity, but as you can see when we move it with our empty, it drags in onto our model. And so for the viewing, I'm going to view the gradient, and we can see we have all these options here. I'm just going to make the gradient a bit more visible by rotating the empty around. We just go like that. So first up, we have the gradient color feature here, which we can set it to whatever color we want. Invert. That's very self-explanatory. Tune steps, we saw that before with the stylized lighting. And gradient style, we saw that as well before. If you switch it to linear, it'll just become like a regular gradient with no tune shading on it whatsoever. So yeah, tune steps. Painterly effect / distort. What this does is it'll distort the gradient. As you can see here, that's what it's doing. Noise / Voronoi switch, once again, it just allows us to have a different type of distortion if that's what we want. Now we have painterly distort scale, which we can scale along the X or Y or Z axis if that's what you want to do. That would be a cool animation idea actually. Then we have painterly scale uniform, which is just scaling all of these X, Y, and Z axes all at once. So as you can see, that's what that does. Location obviously just moves around the location of the distortion, and that's basically if you want to animate it or something. It's just a really cool way to do it. And so yeah, after that we have texture coordinate settings, which if you don't want to, I guess, use the empty for whatever reason, you can move it around with the X over here, or the Y, or the Z. But I highly recommend just using the empty because it's so just easy to use, right? You can rotate it on the fly, scale it on the fly, like I'm hitting SZ here to scale it. Everything is just so visual that way. You don't have to think about any of these like technical terms. So yeah, select object is basically, you can see it's selected to this current empty if you look at the name up here. And by default, we're using object coordinates, which is basically using the empty. In order to use this empty, we need object coordinates enabled. So I really don't recommend at all using UV or window down here. To be honest, in the final version of this add-on, I'm probably not going to even have this here because it's so useless. So I'm just going to have object coordinates because that's what we should be using. And then we have mask down here. So if you hit new, and whenever creating a new image in this add-on, make sure that for this color setting here, you click it and set alpha to 0. And yeah, that's all you have to do pretty much. You can set your width and height to whatever you want and set the name to whatever you want. So I'll set it to like a gradient rectangle mask and hit new image. So as you can see, nothing's updated yet, but if I drag this enable mask feature and then go to with the sphere selected, I can go to texture paint mode. And one thing I want to say is make absolutely sure that the texture displayed up here is the same as the one that you want to draw on. Because right now it says like crayon03.jpg, which is not what we want to draw on. We want to draw on the gradient rectangle mask that we just made. So I'm going to switch it to that. And as you can see now, if we draw, we can mask out the gradient. So as you can see, as I draw with white, I'm masking out the gradient, and it's basically just getting rid of it. So that's cool. You can also use these brushes that'll be here when you enable the add-on and create a material for the first time. So if I turn on my tablet, you can see I can very nicely just mask out things if that's what I want to do. But yeah, so you don't have to do that if you don't want to, but just an option I'm saying. And also if you want, you can import one of the stylized textures. So for example, I can grab one here once again, and as you can see, it's masking out the gradient with that texture. So yeah, that's how the mask feature works. It's pretty self-explanatory and it's similar for a lot of the other effects. So I'll get rid of that because we don't need it. I'll also tell you now about the swap effects feature. So obviously we have our stylized light computing here first, and then we have the gradient after it. But if you want the gradient to be first and come before the light is added, we can use this effect position swapping menu, and you can just choose the two effects you want to swap, hit swap effects, and as you can see now, we go from base color to gradient, then to stylized light. So yeah, next up we have the local gradient sphere, which is very similar to the other rectangle gradient that we just had. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the delete effect menu, select gradient 1, which was this rectangle gradient that we were using, and I'm going to hit delete. So now that's gone from our list. Alright, so if I hit add with the local gradient sphere effect selected, you can see now we once again get an empty, and this time, if we bring it close to our model, you can see once we get the empty close to it, we get a sphere gradient instead, or a circle gradient. Alright guys, just a little detour here. I want to say that if you have an effect, you can use the duplicate menu down here to duplicate it. So if we duplicate sphere gradient, and then as you can see now we have two of them. And you might notice these empties, they might start to get a bit cluttered in your viewport. You might have a lot of them. So what you can do is you can just select them and hit the H key to hide it. And now you won't see them anymore. And if you want to see them again, there's two ways. You can either hit Alt-H, which will unhide everything in your viewport, or if you go here to the Objects panel and you open up the object, you can see you have your empties here that you can just unhide very easily. So it's exactly the same as the other gradient. Obviously you can scale around and rotate and like move the empty. And then you have all these settings here. You can switch the color, you can invert it, You can use tune steps as well. You have the painterly effect / distort thing too, and we can switch it. Distort scale, obviously all this stuff I already showed you guys, so I'm just going to speed through it a bit here. You have scale, uniform, location, texture coordinate settings, obviously just use object coordinates, and I'm probably going to remove these UV and window features here because they're not useful at all. And then we have mask once again, but I already showed you that. So yeah, that's pretty much it for the sphere gradient effect. And I think I'm going to get rid of it now. So actually, I guess I'll keep it. Alright, so I'm going to switch our viewing to base color so that it collapses everything else. And then now we're going to add another effect. This time we'll add the... So now we'll add the Specular Reflection Dynamic EV effect. Sorry for the long name, just trying to make it as clear as possible. And I'm actually going to add a monkey just so that showing this is a bit easier, and I think it makes a bit more sense to use a monkey as well because it's a bit of a more complex form. So I have a monkey here. I'm going to shade it smooth, just hit Ctrl+1 to subdivide it a bit, and I'm going to set the material to be this material that we made. So as you can see now, both of these objects are using the same material. If I move around the empty, you can see it updates here as well because the monkey is using the same exact material as the sphere. So we're going to add the specular reflection effect now. So I'm going to add effect, and as you can see now on the sphere here, we have this highlight, I guess you could say, on the top of it, and that's because it'll be in whatever direction the sun is usually. So if I move the sun around, as you can see, the highlights start to form on Suzanne, you can see them. And if we want to make them more apparent, let's just view the specular reflection layer. We can adjust the roughness, and you can adjust the color as well to whatever you want. So we can set it to maybe a value of like 2 or like 1. And then you have other features here like strength, and this is for distorting the specular. So if I look at the sphere here, as you can see, as I drag this up, it becomes distorted a bit. And as before with the stylized lighting, you can adjust it with all of these scale features, and yeah, it looks pretty cool like that. So as you can see, Suzanne now has it as well. One other thing I should say is if you want to bake specular reflections, you should understand that they're going to appear in the direction of the sunlight. So as you can see, when I rotate here, what Blender is doing is it moves the specular reflection to like where I'm looking, but when you bake it, obviously that's not possible to represent in a texture. So what will happen is in the baked texture, the specular reflection is going to be over here at like the top of the sphere because that's the direction that the sunlight is going in. By the way guys, this is just me from the future. I want to say I added a mask feature as well to the specular reflection effect. So now you can once again create an image texture, hit enable on the mask, draw in whatever areas you don't want the speculars to be. Okay guys, also for the specular reflection effect, I want to talk about the painterly shader, enable painterly effect thing down here. Doing this in another file because I'm doing this in the future, but basically if we enable the painterly effect, and what I want to do is you don't always have to do it if you don't want to, but like I like to switch the blend style to linear when I'm dealing with a painterly effect. So as you can see there, we get this really interesting reflection now. So if I play with the roughness, you can see we can get it bigger. Down here the menu's a little messed up, but just after where it says painterly effect, we have scale, so we could play with the scale if we want. So maybe if I want this to be like 2, we could scale it down like that. You have distort strokes if you want to distort it a bit. So like right there I distorted it, and as you can see now, it's a bit more distorted. Smooth strokes as well, and then you have strokes map, which is this by default. You can change it to whatever you want. So yeah, I always like to use this. It's a pretty fun thing to use. You can play around with it, make it bigger like that maybe. And so yeah, that's what's just so cool about this Addon, is that like everything is so adjustable and can be easily manipulated on the fly. Now what I want to add after that is I'm going to add an ambient occlusion layer. So if I add this, so this you'll only see it if you get your model close to the other model, and as you can see now we have some ambient occlusion that you can see is appearing in between our models. So basically if I had a cube as well, you can see like any model that's just like close to our shader that's using ambient occlusion, you can see it kind of forms it. You can use the strength feature, and you can use the ramp slider as well for how far you want it to spread. You have distance as well. Then we have mask once again, which obviously if you create a new one with, once again, always set your alpha values to 0, and you hit new and wait for it to load. and we set mask influence to 1 so that when we draw, it's actually going to update. And then we go into texture paint mode. And actually, one interesting thing here is these two objects are of the same material, right? If I wanted to draw a mask for the ambient occlusion, I should probably use this make material / effects single user copy option up here. Now, if we adjust any of our parameters, you can see it doesn't affect on the sphere anymore because this monkey is using its own material, as we can see. So let me undo that. One other important thing I want to say is don't use this 2 button up here. I know you guys who are familiar with materials and stuff know like what the 2 button does. Obviously it does the same thing and make the current object selected have a unique copy of the material so that it's different from the rest. But don't use this button here, use this one here. The reason why is because this one does stuff with the add-on as well and updates some things, so it's just better practice to use this make material single user copy button here instead of the number icon. So just remember to do that. Okay, we're done with that, and I'm going to delete the ambient occlusion layer here because we don't really need it anymore. So I'm just going to delete that. And then now what I want to add is a circular lighting layer. So I'm going to hit add here. And as you can see, we got empty spawned once again. And if I move it, as you can see, it has a kind of lighting effect. And what circular lighting is you can think of it kind of like similar to our sphere gradients, but instead it's like lighting. So as you can see, as I scale it up, it's adding light. And as you move it around, you can see it's very easy to use. Scale it up, and you have these options here as well for the shadow value and the light value. And it's also probably like one of the most simple effects in this whole add-on. So yeah. Alright guys, so the next effect that we're going to add is a really fun one. We can add the watercolor / charcoal effect. So if we add that. Okay guys, so actually for the charcoal and watercolor effect, I made a few updates to it later on, so I'm doing it in a new file, recording this in the future. So basically to add it, obviously we go here, choose watercolor / charcoal effect, hit add, make sure you view it. As you can see, it does nothing at first, but we have to open up our image texture. So we could use, let's see, you can use any of these, maybe let's use this one. I like to bring up the texture scale to something like 4 or 5-ish. I'm also going to change the background color a bit. Later on in this video I talk more about the background settings and what those do, but I'm just going to set it to white for now so you guys can follow along a bit easier. So you can play around with the overall blend, overall strength, and all these features here. If you increase this, as you can see, we start to get that crayon or charcoal or whatever you select it as your image texture to be. And if you increase this setting, the overall blend edges, and decrease the overall strength, you can get it to affect like just the edges if you want, which is pretty cool. So just play around with that, and you can choose any of these image textures, or you can download one from the internet. It's like if I choose, I don't know, this one for example, you can see now this is here too. Yeah, it's just overall an awesome effect, I think. As you can see, I tried to link it to the bottom point there, but it looks pretty bad. So obviously we have to make this its own copy, and now we can adjust this one separately. So let's try and do that. Yep. There we go, now it looks a lot better. If you want to add an outline to things that are using the watercolor / charcoal effect, I recommend you use the edge detector colored edges instead of the object outline. It just works a bit better with this effect. So as you can see, if you're going to use this, it's probably a good idea to add some bump, some distortion to the lighting as well, so it doesn't look so flat. And you could also add like a texture overlay effect. So if we view that, maybe increase the scale a bit, play around with the strength. I think it just makes it like a lot nicer. And now, as you can see, since we applied those like distortions. Alright guys, so there's also this mask feature that I added on the bottom here, so you can see me making a mask real quick. And basically what it lets you do is, if you enable the mask, you can just draw on your model, and basically if you draw with white, you can have places that are less transparent. So, you know, if you're using like the sliders and they're not giving you the effect you want, you can always go in with your brush here, and using the mask effect, you can just draw in where you want it to be more opaque rather than being like transparent. So yeah, it's just a cool feature that's there. I should also mention one thing that's pretty important is up here you have this blend mode feature, and when you add the watercolor / charcoal effect, it switches it to alpha hash, but you could also use alpha blend. But personally, I prefer to use alpha blend when I have the charcoal / watercolor effect enabled, because it's just a bit nicer in my opinion. But you could also use alpha blend. There's a small chance though when you use alpha blend you might get some issue with the edges of the model. Usually it doesn't happen, but I'm just saying it might happen. But yeah, so you can choose whether you want to use alpha blend or alpha hashed. I prefer alpha hashed personally. Alright, so yeah, it's overall just a very awesome effect. Now I'm going to go back to the old file that I was on before. But alright, I'm going to leave this to be looking a bit like this, and we'll move on from there. I'm also going to delete all these extra objects. And so yeah, now let's add another effect. We're going to add the texture paint / draw for all colors, whatever colors you want. And this is the main texture paint / draw feature. You can see down here there's this draw / paint with a single color one as well. But that's if you only want to draw a single color. Obviously, usually you're going to be using this texture paint / draw all colors one. Alright, so let's add the texture paint / draw effect with all colors. And sorry about the static in the background, that's just my fan. It's pretty hot here and I need it on right now. So yeah, anyways, I'll hit add effect. And as you can see, it shows up here. Texture paint number 1, that's what it's going to be called. And then let's switch our viewing to be on the texture paint effect. And so now you can see we have these options here. We have drawing texture, we have mask, blend mode, and whether you want to enable the mask or not is up to you. So just for the sake of visibility, I'm going to disable our charcoal / watercolor effect for now. So I'm just going to set the visibility to 0 because right now I just want to show you guys the texture painting and using the custom brushes that I made. So basically, for the texture paint effect, it's really simple. For drawing texture, just hit new. Once again, set the color, set the alpha to 0. Make sure you always do that. Name it whatever you want. We'll call it like, I don't know, brush paint test. And width and height we'll keep at 1024 for now, or you know, maybe we'll put it at like 2048. It's up to you. Obviously, the higher resolution you use, the better it will look. So we'll use 2048 for now. I'm going to hit new image. And okay, so now I'm going on my drawing tablet. I recommend using a drawing tablet for using any of these brushes. Some of these brushes completely require pen pressure and a tablet, some of them don't. But so yeah, I mean, I just recommend painting with the tablet. It's going to be a lot easier. By the time this add-in is released, I don't know if this is the finalized version of the brushes. I might have added some more, but yeah, so you have a bunch here that you can work with. And so maybe if we want to use this like soft crayon brush, we can select it. Remember, just right here, select it. And also, remember up here, we have our image texture selected to something else than what we want. We want our drawing texture to be this brush paint test image texture that we made, so I'm going to switch it here to brush paint test. And now, using pen pressure here, I'm just reaching over. I'm just going to demonstrate this very basically for you guys. Obviously, select your color up here. You can eyedrop parts of the texture and just kind of like draw around it like this. If we want maybe something more gouache. As you can see, this is what the gouache brush looks like. Really cool. And yeah, again, you can use whatever color as well. Like we can use red here, white like hi guys, and just play around with all the different brushes that are here and you'll get something that looks pretty darn cool. I don't know if there's a shortcut in Blender for opening up the eyedropper tool. I looked it up and I couldn't find it, so if you guys know what the shortcut is for using the eyedropper tool, let me know. I'm sure there definitely is one, I just haven't really looked into it that much. One thing we messed up was I forgot to split the two materials to make them separately for the UV sphere and the monkey. So as you can see, when we were drawing on the monkey, some of it got onto the UV sphere here as well, and that's because since they're sharing the same material, obviously Blender's going to think that we're also trying to draw on this UV sphere here, which wasn't the case. So if you want to fix that, once again, you can hit the make material / effects single user copy, and then you can delete the texture paint effect on this one. Yeah, now it's gone. As you can see, the circular light that we added is like kind of going behind the brush strokes that we made. If you want to fix that, you can use the effect position swapping menu. Basically, you can swap different effects in terms of like their location in the layer system. So if I want to swap like the texture paint that we just did and put it behind the circular light, we can just swap these two and hit swap effects. And then now, as you can see, it works a lot better. Okay, one other thing for the texture paint effect is we can use a mask if we want. So if I hit new and call it just like texture paint mask, I'm gonna reduce the resolution because I don't think we need that much. And then hit new image, and then slide this enable mask slider to be 1. Now if we draw with our, let me try and find the, if we draw with it, and we draw white, make sure when you're drawing on a mask you draw black and white values. So white is going to be, it's going to remove the strokes that you made, and black will add them back if you already removed them. So if we want to mask out any of the brush strokes that we made, we can just draw with white on our texture paint mask, and as you can see, it's getting rid of them now, and it's going back to what we had before. So that's just a cool thing to know. We're going to now move on to the dynamic texture effect. And I spelled texture wrong here, I'll fix that later. But yeah, so I think for now I'm going to just remove a few effects so that we're only focusing on the dynamic texture for now. So I'm going to delete the texture paint, and I'm going to also delete circular light. And by the way, when we deleted that circular light, you'll notice as well, we were using it here in this sphere. You can see the circular light node is, or sorry, the circular light effect is still there because this is a different material now, but it was using the same empty as the monkey was using for its circular light effect, but it's gone now because we deleted it. If you want to add it back, you can just hit Shift A, add an empty, and pretty much you can just hit X here and select that empty as your circular light object, and as you can see now it's back to normal. But yeah, just in case, if you guys accidentally have an empty being used by multiple objects, you can always add it back like that. Okay, so now we're going to use the dynamic texture effect. I actually think it'll be better to display this on the sphere, so what I'm going to do is, on the sphere I'm going to add the dynamic texture. For now I'm just going to disable a few other things so that it doesn't take up space in our view, so that I can just show you what the dynamic texture is doing. So I'm removing some effects here. Okay, so I'm going to hit Add with the dynamic texture effect selected, and I'm going to view it, view dynamic texture. And so there's a lot of options here, and the dynamic texture effect is probably one of the most versatile effects that we have here. And it might look a bit intimidating at first, but it's actually really, really simple. I'm going to show you guys how it's done. So basically we have this empty that was added that controls the position for the dynamic texture. As you can see, at first it's just a sphere or a circle. And that's because if you look down here at this mask selector feature, we have gradient sphere mask % set to 1. So that's what we're getting right now, we're getting the sphere. But if we also slide up these other things, like if we slide up the noise mask as well, now you can see our sphere starts to get broken up by the noise. So basically what it's doing is it's combining all of these different, it's combining all of these different effects very easily. So as you can see here as I move it around, what we have right now is we have a sphere mask and a noise mask. If I disable the sphere mask, as you can see now all we have is a noise mask that we can move around. And yeah, so if I add this back, the sphere mask, just like that. Also, some of these options up here are very self-explanatory. We have the color, we have blend mode, we have the tune/linear switch, which I showed you guys before. You can use linear if you want something that is just linear. And I'll show you how to fix like the whiteness in the back later, but let's put that back to step linear for now. You have steps obviously, and you have invert, which you can invert it if you want. So now you might be wondering why this issue is happening with the steps, where it's like changing the entire value of the model. So it's really easy to fix this actually. Just remember, whenever you see steps, steps is very closely linked to the mask clamp min and the mask clamp max. So if I increase the steps like this, you can drag this mask clamp feature, and as you can see now, we can get it back to what it was before, except now it's more stepped. So yeah, if you're having issues with steps, just use this mask clamp min and the mask clamp max feature, and from there you'll be able to get the look that you want. I'm going to set this back to like 2 or even 1, and once again I'm just using the mask clamp min and the mask clamp max to basically control the spreading. You might be wondering why this is useful. The reason why is because if you've seen any of my other videos, we're always using things like masks and like tune shaded things like that, and so this basically just automates it and makes it so that you can add these masks without really even thinking that much. So if I disable noise, you can see now we just have a sphere again. You can enable Voronoi, which is going to give us these dots. You can enable tile/brick, which works a lot better on like flat surfaces, so I think I'll show you guys that a bit later. But yeah, there's that. There's this foam factor as well if you want to make like a foam looking thing. And you look down here where we have select mask to edit. And what this lets us edit is any of these masks up here. So if we have noise mask set to 1, for example, and we want to edit the noise mask individually, we can go here and hit edit noise mask, and now you can see we have all of these features here that we can edit. So you can edit the clamp, which is an important thing. Once again, clamp is a very important feature for just changing the spreading of any effect. And so yeah, always be adjusting that if you need to. You have detail as well, roughness, and all of this is just stuff that will affect the noise mask that we have enabled. You also have position, and so you can adjust all of that as well for the individual noise mask. Same goes for all of these other effects here. If we use like wave, for example, it might be a little bit aligned horribly. So once again, you can just rotate your sphere a bit. I'm hitting RR to go into easy rotate mode, I guess that's what it's called. Trackball, I think is what it's called. But yeah, you can just position it however you want. And once again, just go here, edit wave mask, and you can edit the wave mask individually, change the clamp, the distortion, all that as well. You can edit the sphere gradient mask as well, very easily. And so yeah, you just have all these different effects that you can enable if you want, and you can edit them all individually with this mask edit feature, and it's just really cool. Anyways, if we go down here, we have distort mask settings, which allows us to distort the mask overall. So as you can see, we're distorting it a bit, and that's really cool. You also have the distort scale, which will allow us to change the scale of the distort. I'm going to switch it from wave to noise so that it is a bit more apparent. As you can see, just like that. And we can move it around, and it's just so dynamic, which is so awesome. And you have all these features here. You can just move it around if you want. When I say animate painterly distort here, I might change the name to like location, because it's the same thing. When it says animate, it's just location. It's just that I happen to usually animate this parameter because it's pretty cool to animate. So yeah, and then once again, you have a mask that you can add right here if you want. Just enable it if you add it. I've already shown you how to add masks a lot, so I'm sure you can assume what that does. If we draw, we can hide parts of the mask. Then here you have mask texture coordinate settings, which is, by default, it uses object coordinates, which allows us to use this object to basically make our dynamic texture. But if you use UV, it'll be different, and it won't be affected by the object anymore, and rather, instead, what you're going to have to do is use the position features here to move everything around. Obviously, I usually like to just use object coordinates because it is just so easy and so visual. So that's why I recommend just using that instead. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the dynamic texture effect. You have mask object right here as well, so you can select what object it uses. I recommend not really messing with this much unless you accidentally delete it and then you add it again. And I'm going to show you guys in later videos in the future how I use it like all the time. I'm sure if you've seen any of my videos before, you can understand why this is useful. It's because usually I'm just using nodes to make this stuff, and this just completely automates it, and it's just amazing. But yeah, so I'm done with that now. I'm going to delete the dynamic texture because we don't need it anymore. And now, I guess we can go back to our monkey. And now we have one effect called the texture overlay, so I'm going to add that. So as you can see immediately, what it did was it basically added this texture overlay effect to our model. So I'm going to go to the texture overlay effect and view it. As you can see, we have strength here, so you can adjust the strength. Texture, you can, by default, it has this crayon type of texture. If you want to change it, all you have to do is hit X, then hit open, wait for it to load, and then you can just select whatever image texture that you want. Once again, you can make your own, or you can use one of the ones that I provided here. You can move the location around, and you can also change the rotation if that's what you want to do. Then you have the X, Y, and Z scale. This is really important. If you click and drag down, you can select multiple at once and scale it all at once. So that's something I really recommend. You can use the UV/window coordinate switch here. By default, it's using UV. As you can see, that's why there's no parallax. It's just based on the unwrap of our model, which Suzanne by default is unwrapped pretty well. So that's why it looks good. Make sure if you're using UV coordinates that you unwrap your model. Otherwise, it'll look weird. Like if you have a character or something that's not unwrapped, don't expect it to work properly unless you're using window coordinates. Once again, we have mask right here, so you can hit new and draw a mask if you want to hide the texture overlay from certain areas. But yeah, next we have Crosshatch Lighting, EV. Honestly, I'm going to just add another monkey to display this, because the reason why is we already have a stylized light here on this model, and so pretty much This Crosshatch Lighting Eevee, it's very similar to the Stylized 3D Lighting main, except it uses like a parallax cross-hatching effect, which I'm about to show you. So as you can see, if we try to add it to our monkey here, it doesn't do anything because we already have a Stylized Light dynamic. We have a new monkey. I'm just going to subdivide it, shake it smooth, and you don't have to do that if you don't want to. We'll add a new material again, call this just like crosshatch demonstration, and if I hit add, as you can see already, we have the cross-hatching effect going. If we set our base color to something like, I don't know, white, and we set our light value to something, our shadow value to something really dark, you can see it looks pretty manga. And once again, you have your tune steps options here. So if you want to add more steps to it, you can do that. You have your light slider, just like we had with the Stylized 3D Lighting effect. You can colorize things very easily to whatever you want. Crosshatch strength just determines the strength of the crosshatch. Then we have scale, which you can see the higher you scale, the more dense it'll be. The lower you scale, the less dense it's going to be. So it's up to you what you want to use there. You can change the detail very easily, the roughness, which goes hand in hand with detail. And you can switch between using window coordinates or UV coordinates. I highly recommend just using window to do. And actually, I think in the final version of this, I'm probably going to get rid of the UV option for the crosshatch lighting because it's not useful at all. And using parallax is just the best. And it's really customizable, so you can have it however you like. By the way, guys, there's also this dotted tone thing that I added down here as well. So if you want, you could disable the crosshatch strength and enable the dotted tone one. And pretty much, when you enable it, it'll give you all these options down here. Let me change the light slider a bit so that we can see more. So there's a lot you could do with this. You have dot randomness, scale, if you want to make your dots bigger or smaller. You can see right now they're a bit of an oval shape, so maybe I'll change the scale and the X a bit so that it becomes more like a circle. Dot clamp, you can change like how big you want each individual dot to be. Detail just gives you more detail. Invert allows you to switch if you want the dots to be in the bright areas. And we could use like steps here, for example. Yeah, so we could use like steps here if you want. If you want as well, you could combine it with the crosshatch strength, so you can get something that's like really interesting and kind of like a blend between the two if you're going for that type of look. So yeah, you notice sometimes if you're sliding it, you could actually get these circles to appear in the dark areas as well. And that's another cool thing that could happen if you play around with it a little bit. So yeah, overall, just a pretty awesome effect that is very dynamic, and I like to use it a lot. Now the next thing we're going to look at is the dynamic brushstrokes effect. So I'm going to demonstrate this on the sphere actually, because I think it will be more apparent if I do it there. So I'm going to hit add for dynamic brushstrokes, and we're viewing it. And basically the way this works is we have this brush colors / values feature up here, and pretty much what this is, this value min and value max, means what is the minimum value for our brush strokes and what is the maximum value. So if we set min to be something like 0.52 and max to be something like 1.4, 1.5, you can see now our brush strokes, the min is a value of like 0.52 and a max is a value of 1.46 for our brush strokes. And you have all these features here, like shape randomness, noise randomness. I recommend holding shift while you drag on these because they are very, very crazy. Like if you just drag, it can become a lot distorted really quickly. So you might want to just hold shift and distort it a little bit with the noise randomness. Then you have scale uniform, if you want to scale it a bit. Obviously, you don't want to scale it too much because it won't look as authentic. You have stroke scale as well, so that's something very easy to use. Noise / Voronoi switch, kind of useless for this, but it's there if you want to use it. And you have the distort X scale and the distort Y scale if you want to distort things even further. So just like that, you can have this really nice brush strokes effect on your model. Then over here we have brush texture settings, which is what actually gives it the texture. If we delete this, as you can see, it looks a lot worse. And basically what we do is we use this smooth feature here, as well as the texture contrast feature, but we don't have a texture selected anymore because we just deleted it. So you can hit open, and once again add whatever you want. Maybe you can add this one. As you can see now, what you want to do is you basically want to just play with the smooth feature and the texture contrast feature until you get something that you think looks good, and also play around with the texture scale feature, and eventually you'll get something that looks nice. So yeah, it's very dynamic and very adjustable. So yeah, the dynamic brushstrokes feature or effect is probably one of my favorites, and yeah, it's just really cool. Up here you also have the hue minimum and the hue maximum. If you want to have like hue shifts or make it like psychedelic. We have saturation minimum and saturation maximum. So if we decrease the saturation maximum. So yeah, that's it for the brushstrokes effect. I'm going to delete that for now. Or maybe I guess we'll keep it. But yeah, after that we have a colored circular light. And what that is, if I hit add effect, I already showed you guys circular light before, so it's very similar to that, except the colored circular light is a lot more customizable, if that makes sense. So if we view it, you can see it now. We have a color feature as well. By default, it's kind of like an orangish color. If we wanted to affect the monkey as well, we can add a colored circular light effect here. Wait for it to update and then view it here. And then for the empty, as you can see, he added a new one for the monkey because the monkey is a different material now from our sphere, but we could actually just delete it if we want, and then instead we can set the object to be, the empty object to be the one that the sphere is using. So now both of them use the same circular light effect. Okay, so yeah, if you want, you can change the color to whatever you want. By default, the value is set very high, so you're probably going to want to turn that down to like 30 maybe. So we can set it to be like a green color if you want, or whatever. And as you can see, you have overall brightness, which is basically, you might get texture bleeding issues with the colored circular light. And so in that case, what you want to do is decrease the overall brightness. That's just the thing that's there in case you need to use it. We have the clamp dark areas min and the clamp dark areas max. It's hard for me to easily explain what this does, but basically what it kind of does is if you drag up the max feature here, it'll kind of remove the circular light from the dark areas of the model. As you can see here, this top part of our sphere is a darker color, so if we drag up the max, you can see it's kind of removing it from that area a bit. And if you're wondering why that's useful, basically there's a number of reasons why. It's not obvious here, but if you're making something like a face and you use a circular light in the face, the circular light, if you don't, I guess, remove it from certain dark areas of the face, it won't look as good. And that goes the same for if you're making like an asset or something else. It's generally better to clamp it from the dark areas so that it appears mostly in the bright areas. So as you can see, if I drag this up, same with Suzanne, if I show you here, if we drag it up, it's removing it from the dark areas of our model, which through experimentation, trust me, you'll realize why that's actually a good thing. And yeah, once again, you have mask features here if you want to mask it out by drawing or using an image texture, or like the stylized texture to mask it out, and that's completely up to you. So now we have a pretty cool layer of effects system working. So now that we're done with the colored circular light effect, we can go to the edge outline, and if I hit add and I view it, edge outline, what this does is we have another effect here called object outline, which is what we're usually going to use to add outlines, but you can use this one as well if you want to add an outline to your object without changing the geometry at all. Pretty much we have these edge value features, which lets you decrease basically the value of the edges. So if you want it to be brighter or darker, you can adjust it like that. Edge saturation as well, which if I up this a bit you can see more. And then we have spreading from min. You're going to have to play around with these features a bit, especially on whatever model you're using. You can basically adjust how thick you want your outline to be. On the release of this as well, you'll probably see a mask feature here as well. I didn't add it yet, but it's going to probably be there. So there's going to be a mask feature which lets you basically draw in certain areas if you want the edge outline to be occluded from those areas. That's the edge outline effect. Now I'm going to delete this for now, and now we're going to add is the colored edges, which is very similar, except this one, it's a lot easier to just pick whatever color you want, and the previous one was based on the pre-existing values that you had in your model for, like, you know, the colors and all that, so that's why there were like value sliders and stuff. This one is just like you kind of pick a color. Obviously you got the blend features and all of these features to adjust the thickness of that one. And here I already added the mask feature. If you slide to enable it, you can just add a mask and then pretty much just draw out areas that you do not like. So just like that, as you can see, you can draw out these areas from having an outline, and that's just really cool. So yeah, there's that if you want to use it. Once again, you could also import an image texture as well, and what that'll let you do is import something. It's hard to see here, but if I zoom in more, maybe you can see it a bit better. It'll break up the outline a bit, and so let me increase the sizing just a little bit. And you can see now the outline has that sort of textured effect to it. It's pretty easy to understand. We have HSL Effect. This one is also extremely easy to understand. If you hit add, what it lets you do is just shift the hue, shift the saturation and shift the value if that's what you want to do. Nothing complicated there whatsoever. In the future, I might add a bright contrast effect as well. Alright, so I'm going to delete that because we're not doing anything with it. And then we have the object outline feature. So if I hit add effects, you can see what happens is we shift over to a totally new material. And you can see here it says outline for Suzanne, because that's what this model is called. It's called Suzanne. So you can see outline for Suzanne was created. And you can see here you have outline color. You can set it to whatever you want. We'll keep it as black for now. Then you have thickness. And this is geometry based. If you guys are familiar with the solidify outline protocol, that's basically what it's doing. As you can see here in the modifier stack, you can see here SB, that stands for shader builder, outline for Suzanne. You can change the vertex group if you want the outline to only be applied to certain vertices. So you'd use the vertex groups tab here and create one and then just enter it here. You guys might notice this outline texturing drop down menu right here is collapsed by default. That's a bit of a bug that I'll have to fix, but to fix it, it's very easy. Just go to new material, and for viewing, set it to show all items, and then if we go back to our outline, as you can see now we have here all of these effects that we can use. So it's very similar to the watercolor / charcoal effect, where we can import a texture. So we can import like this, for example, and as you can see now the outline gets broken up by that texture. If you look really closely, you can see. And then you can blend it and make it more or less transparent, and yeah, just by playing around with it you guys will get a feel for it. There's not really that much else to say. You have scaling features, and yeah. If you want to delete your outline, there's a couple different ways. One is with the outline for Suzanne material selected, you can just hit fully delete selected shader and it'll delete it. And the other way is you can go here to the delete effect menu and select the shader builder outline for Suzanne and hit delete effect. I prefer to just select the material and hit fully delete selected shader instead, because it just cleans things up a bit better. So I'll hit that. As you can see now the outline is gone, and yeah. So the next effect we have after that is the object randomization effect. So this is pretty interesting. Basically what it is it's for if you have multiple objects using the same material and you want to randomize their value or hue or saturation. So if we view it, basically if I duplicate Suzanne a bunch of times, and if we use this value min and value max feature, we can set basically a randomized value between these two values that the value of the model will be, if that makes sense. So we have between 0.61 and 1.39 now. So what it's doing is basically assigning a random value to our model between those two values. So if I keep on duplicating, you can see they all have a slightly different value to them. And we can exaggerate it even more if we exaggerate these values. You can see they all have a different brightness or value. And it's the same for the hue and saturation min and max settings. You can set a minimum and a maximum. And now if you duplicate, you can see we have different ranges of saturation. And then you have the seed as well, which basically if you duplicate a bunch, you can change the seed for any of these values if you want to get a different, basically randomization seed. So yeah, that's pretty useful sometimes for adding variety. If you have a, like a leaf or something that you're duplicating all around and you want to add some variety to it. So yeah, I'm going to delete that for now because we don't need it. And next we have add a fog object. And actually I'm going to do these last, the fog, steam, and Godray effect. We're just going to skip to the draw with Vertex Paint for now. Now Vertex Painting, what it is basically instead of drawing on UVs, you can draw on the actual vertices of the model. So if I hit add effect here, I usually never use this effect, to be honest with you. I prefer to just use texture painting on a UV unwrapped model, because then you can, export it and do all those good things very easily. But if you want a Vertex Paint on a model that isn't unwrapped, you can do that too. If you hit add color group, just call it whatever you want. I'll just call it like Vertex Paint. And then for color, make sure you set alpha to 0, hit OK. And then for this color attribute, you have to set it to whatever you just named your color group to be. So I named it Vertex Paint, so I just typed that in there. If you ever forget, you can come here on the right hand side of the screen, and in the color attributes you can see the name of any of the Vertex Paint groups that you've made. Now that we have this, if we hit open to select a painting texture, we can choose one, and pretty much if we go to Vertex Paint mode and draw, you can see you can't really see it that well. I mean, you can see it a little bit, but the point is you can now Vertex Paint. And if you want it to be a lot more apparent, what you have to do is subdivide your model, because vertex painting is based on the vertices, and as you can see here, we don't have that many vertices. So if we subdivide, now it's going to be even easier for us to vertex paint on it. So if you grab your pen, you can very easily see now you can just vertex paint with whatever color you want. You can use like blue maybe, or red. Once again, you can change the X, Y, and Z scale of the painting texture. The more geometry, the more vertices your model has, the more easy it's going to be for you to vertex paint. So if I do it again, subdivide, now it's going to be really easy for us to do some vertex painting. But yeah, that's how you vertex paint if that's what you want to do. By default, it uses UV for the painting texture, but you can switch to windowed if you want. And what that'll let you do is basically have this parallax effect. But yeah, that's that. So I'm going to undo all of that and unsubdivide my model a bit as well. And then I'm going to delete the Vertex Paint effect because we don't need it for now. Next off, we have a Displace effect, which lets you displace your model if you want. I'm actually going to add back the object outline for this to show you guys. It's pretty cool because the outline gets displaced as well. Thicken this a bit maybe. And now if we add a Displace effect, hit add, it goes out of whack. But basically, if we scroll down, we have Displace effect number 1 over here. And you can adjust the strength. By default, we're not using any texture though, which is an issue. So you can add cloud displace texture. Obviously also, if you go down here, if you guys are familiar with the texture tab, you can create a new texture and just set it to any of these things that you want and mess with it if that's what you want to do. But just for ease of use, I did add a feature here. Where you can just hit add clouds displace texture and it'll add one really easily right there for you. Obviously, if you want to use any of the other ones, you can just select from down here. If you want to use Voronoi, you can do that. But yeah. Anyways, you might have noticed that there was an empty added when we added the Displace effect, and that's because the Displace is based on the coordinates of this empty that got added when we added the Displace effect. So if you scale it, as you can see, you can adjust the scale of the distortion. You can adjust the location, the rotation as well. And if we just decrease the strength by a lot, set it to like 0.05 maybe, you can see now we have something that's a lot cooler. And you know, you can animate your empty going down if you want your object to have a sort of waviness effect to it. And yeah, so I'm going to delete that for now because we don't need it once again. For some reason I don't see it here in the delete effect menu, so if we hit refresh drop down menus, now you can see we have it here. Now we're done with that, I'll hit delete effect and it's gone. Also going to delete our SP outline, so hit delete for that. And I can remove the material slot as well here because we don't need it. When this add-on's released, I'm going to have an auto update so that you don't see these effects here anymore after you deleted them. But if you have any glitch like that, once again, just hit refresh drop down menus and it'll be gone. Okay, so now that we're done with Displace effect, now we have a really fun thing, which is the Stylized 3D light for objects supported, and it works in both Eevee and cycles without even baking it. So to avoid confusion, because our model does have a lot of effects on it right now, I'm going to just delete the colored circular light. Alright, so now let's actually add this Stylized 3D light per object supported light. So basically, if we hit add here, we get an empty once again. Wait for it to update a bit. And if we move it, you can see now it's very faint, but we actually have a light that we can move around and position however we want. So if we view the light object number 1, which is what this is, we have a bunch of settings here that we can play around with. So for example, highlight value, we can bring that up to like 3. So now the light is like a lot stronger. So you have the steps feature as well. If you want to make it higher steps, you can switch it to linear if you want. If you want it to be just like a regular type of light, you can change the color as well with this feature right here. And you have to drag up the colorize highlight influence if you want it to take effect. And also you can colorize the shadow if that's what you want. And the shadow is basically just wherever this light is not hitting. So yeah, you can position it however you want. If I duplicate Suzanne, as you can see now, the light is shining onto both of the Suzanne objects. And one thing I want to say is if you have like a bunch of objects that you're trying to light and they're like close together, you might have this thing where it's easier to show you with stepped. Basically, you might have this thing where if your empty gets too close to the model, it might start having this glitch here. As you can see, this sort of dark area. It's not a glitch, it just means that your empty is intersecting with the geometry of the monkey. And in that case, what you want to do is always pay attention to this light range feature that we have here. Very similar to the one that we had in the original Stylized 3D lighting main. So if I move this light like back here, for example, you can just use the light range feature to increase the spreading of the light. And that's just really easy. And right now, this light is only affecting our Suzanne object. You can see it's not affecting the sphere over there. If we want it to, we can very easily do that by just adding in a Stylized 3D light per object to our sphere. Obviously, what it's going to do, it's going to add its own light by default, its own empty. But what we could do is just hit X on this and instead use this empty as the one. Now as you can see, it's affecting both. And whoops, I accidentally set that to be as the colored light one rather than the light object. So let me just X that out. Okay, so let's view a light object. And here now we can set the object to be this. As you can see now, if we set the colorized highlight color to be orange. Yeah, so just like that, you can have a light that, if you want, you can have it only affecting one object or material, or you can have it affect multiple ones. It's up to you. For now, I'll just delete the light object from the sphere because we don't need it there anymore. But yeah, as you can see. And another thing I want to say is that you can use this actively in cycles as well. The thing about the Stylized Light main dynamic one that we're using, you can use it in cycles, but not actively, if that makes sense. You'd have to bake it first with the Bake Your Shader feature, as you can see here where it says Bake Diffuse Lighting. You'd have to bake the light first, and then you can go into cycles and have the tune shading. You also have these features here with subdivision surface levels and subdivide mesh levels. What that does is, since this point object lighting is geometry based, that means sometimes things might look unsmooth, and if that's the case, you should increase the subdivision surface levels here. So as you can see, this Suzanne model is already pretty smooth, but if I disable the subdivision that we had earlier, you can see it's not as smooth anymore. And in that case, you might want to increase this feature here, subdivision surface levels. As you can see, we increased it to 1 and everything got a bit more smooth. We still have some spiky areas here, so if we subdivide again, you can see it becomes even smoother. And yeah, so that's that. I'm just going to leave it at 1 for now because we already have a subdivision modifier on our object. And yeah, so that's how that works. Also, you guys can enable this painterly effect down here, and it won't really show up well at all at the beginning because what it is it's geometry based rather than shader based like on the other light effect that we have. So you have to increase the subdivide mesh levels or subdivision surface levels. So if we put it at like 3, as you can see now, it looks a lot better as we rotate it around, and it looks a lot more painterly. Obviously, I think the painterly effect on the regular Stylized 3D lighting effect is better than this one because this one just requires like a lot of subdivision for you to see anything. But like, I mean, what you could do is you could just set it to 0 for now so that while you're working, it's not lagging you or anything. And then in the end, when it's time to render or it's time to bake, you can just turn this back to 3. And yeah, Subdivide Mesh does a similar thing, but the difference is that Subdivide Mesh won't actually smooth anything. So if I increase it, as you can see, we still have this blockiness. And then obviously, after we bake this, then we can get rid of the subdivision surface levels that we added here to smooth things out. And yeah, but that's up to you whether or not you want to bake. We'll talk about that later. Okay, so I'm going to delete this light object for now. And whoops, I think I deleted the circular light by accident again. But let's just delete the light object. And there, it's gone now. So we're back to what we had before. So the next thing is the Add Stylized 3D Sunlighting EV Plus cycles, and this is experimental, so I don't really use it ever, but it's kind of just there if you guys want to use it. Basically, what it's going to do is, I'm going to first just decrease the visibility on the Stylized light layer, so that when I add this, you guys can see the lighting a bit better. So if I add effect, nothing happens. Let's switch the viewing to be the sunlight layer. So pretty much, we have shadow value and highlight value. If I decrease the shadow value, you can see now we have some lighting. And the way it works is it's based on this X, Y, and Z sun direction parameters. So with Z at a value of 1, what it's saying is we want the light coming from the positive Z direction. If you look up here in this gizmo, you can see at the top here is Z1, the bottom of Z -1, the right is Y, the left is -Y, and that's -X, and in front of us is X. So basically, positive Z, the one value in Z here, means that the light is coming from the top. If we increase the Y here, if you can think about what it's going to do, is it's going to shift the light towards the positive Y axis. So if we increase the Y, the sunlight should shift to this right-hand side direction, because that's where positive Y is. So if we add that, you can see it's not exactly working correctly, and that's because our object has been like rotated and transformed and stuff. So if I hit Control A and apply all transforms, and then now you can see it works properly. And obviously if we shift it to the positive X, it'll shift to be in front of us. And basically from this you can have this sort of sunlighting. Once again, for this sunlighting feature, the subdivide mesh thing is a lot more important. You're going to want to increase it pretty high so that you get something that looks good. And once again, that's why it's kind of experimental. But yeah, this is here if you guys want to use it. I accidentally set it to subdivide mesh instead of subdivision surface levels, so let me fix that. There's also this roughness feature. It's a bit weird, but what it does is it kind of makes things a bit more specular. Also, one thing you guys might notice is this Suzanne over here is sharing the same exact material as this one, yet it doesn't have the light for some reason. That's because when you add either the Stylized 3D Light or Stylized 3D Sun Lighting EV plus cycles effects, you want to make sure you also copy the modifiers from the main object that you're working on. So if I shift click on Suzanne here, hit Control L, copy modifiers. Now as you can see, our monkey here as well. So that's just a thing. If you don't see your light showing up on other objects that have the same material, just make sure you hit Control L and copy modifiers. So yeah. But anyways, that's that. I guess we could delete it for now because we don't really need it anymore. So the next effect we're going to work on is the Add Stylized Foam effect. I think it's best if I just add a plane to show you guys this one. Hit New. Add Stylized Foam. We already kind of saw this a little bit before with the dynamic texture, but if I add it, now as you can see we have our empty. You can't see anything right now because the empty is too far away from our model. If I bring it down, now as you can see we have the foam appearing. So just like that you can create a foam effect. You have your steps, which I usually like to keep it at 1. One step just means there will never be any more shades than just like one shade. And you can use this foam spreading feature, which is very correlated with the steps feature and allows you to bring it up. Remember when I said that steps and clamp are very like interlinked? This foam spreading feature is basically a clamp, so that's why steps and foam spreading are together here. So yeah, you can set your color if you want to whatever you like, maybe yellow color. This 2 max feature here, it's more for if you're using like a lot of steps. Let's say I put the steps to like 10 and adjust the spreading until it works properly. Let's see. Just trying to get this. Okay. So as you can see now we have more steps. If I use the 2 max feature, as you can see it kind of like spreads it a bit. So yeah, that's what that does. I'm going to set this back to 1 though. And then we have foam location if you want to adjust the location. You have scale 2, and you can scale in any of these directions. You have foam detail if that's something you want. And you have distort influence as well, which is correlated with the distort scale parameter. So yeah, that's just really cool. You can distort along an axis as well. You can see why this would be very useful. If you're making like a lake or something and you want to have foam, you can just very easily put it over like that. Once again, we have a mask feature here. If you want to draw a mask, you can enable it. And there's the location, rotation, and scale for the mask as well. And also there's UV / it should say UV / object, not generated. Sorry about that. I'm probably going to fix it. After that, there's draw / paint with a single color. This is very self-explanatory. Let's go back to our monkey. Basically, it's no different from the texture paint / draw all colors, except here, it's a single color, meaning you get to choose the color that you want to draw with, and that's the only one you can use. So if I go to texture paint mode, and whoops, I have to make a image texture first. Let's set alpha to 0, and yeah. Make sure also that our image texture is selected to what we have here. As you can see now we're drawing one color, and if you switch it here, it'll switch the color. And we can't anymore choose like blue and then draw that. We're only drawing with black and white, and the color that we use will decide here. You also have blend mode if you want to use like a different blend mode, like color maybe, as a color shift. And yeah, so that's it for the draw single color effect. Let's get rid of that. Texture paint 1 color, delete. Next we have add dynamic texture transparent. Now this is exactly the same as the dynamic texture, except it's transparent this time. So I'm just going to use a sphere actually. I'll add a new sphere to demonstrate this one. If we add it, as you can see we have a empty that comes, and if we get the empty close to our object, you can see what it does is it makes it transparent. Now this is the same exact thing as the dynamic texture that I showed you before, except instead of having a color, it just becomes transparent. So this noise color feature up here doesn't do anything. That's because what it does is it adds transparency. So as you can see, we have a gradient sphere mask at 1, which is why it's a circle. If we increase the noise here, as you can see now, we have something that's a bit noisy. Obviously, if you got rid of sphere completely, now you just have noise, and it's like see-through. So let's get this back, and yeah, it's pretty cool. You can use like a rectangle mask as well and set this to linear, and then have like a kind of linear fade if that's what you want to have. So I mean, I hope you're seeing just like how versatile this could be. I'm going to switch this back to stepped linear. Okay, and you can have it be like stepped as well if that's what you want. I'm going to set steps to 1 and just play around with the mask clamp. Once again, always pay very close attention to these mask clamp or like spreading features, because they're one of the best ways to control things. Go down here, maybe distort it a bit. Yeah, I mean, so it's really cool. You can imagine like if you wanted to animate this, you very easily could. Like you can go to the noise mask and switch the position so that it's like going up. If you wanted, what you could do is add like yet another dynamic texture, and this time we can have it sort of like mask off the top here. Add a noise mask like that. Just scale it a bit. You can adjust the color to whatever you like. Yeah, I mean, it's just so easy to manipulate and change. Also, one thing that's important to say is you have this show backface feature up here. If you guys are familiar with transparency modes and stuff, you'll know that if you want to use transparency, you have to have the blend mode as either alpha blend or alpha hash, and show backface basically just makes it so that we can see through our model kind of to like the other side. So that's just an option you have if you want. I usually keep it disabled though. One other really cool thing you can do in the dynamic texture transparent effect is if we turn off the effects here, I'm going to turn off sphere mask. And if you go down here, I also added this edge transparency thing here. It's really cool. If you turn it off, as you can see, we get these transparent edges. And if you hold shift and you use this blend feature, it's very sensitive, so make sure you're holding shift when you drag. And you can adjust how big you want it. Then if you come back here to your mask, you can obviously enable them now and have like this type of an effect where the edges are solid but the interior is transparent. And you can invert that if you want with this right here where the edges become transparent instead. So yeah, that's really cool. Then also you have this mask speculars option right here. And what that is if we were to add a specular reflection effect, and let me add a sunlight. So normally you can't see it, right? Because the reason why you can't see it is because the dynamic texture transparent is like masking it out. Like the reflection would be like somewhere here maybe, but we can't see it because it's getting masked out. So if you hit this mask speculars feature, and that's supposed to say unmask speculars, by the way, not mask speculars. So unmask speculars, if you click it, you can see now it allows us to have that. It basically just unmasks specular from the specular reflection effect if you have one in your effect layer. It'll just find it and link it up, and then obviously you can play with all those settings and make it however you want. So yeah, it's just a really cool effect. If I turn the base color up to something high, like 7, you can see we can get these glowing edges too, and it's just like really, really cool. So yeah, awesome effect. One thing I forgot to say is you can enable whether or not you want objects to cast shadows. Like for example, this monkey casts a shadow, but if we go here to shadow mode, you can see it says shadow mode right here, and we set it to none. Now you'll see these monkeys don't cast any shadows anymore. So that's something you could do if you want. So yeah, that's it. So if you go to the select effect to add, you can choose bake your shader. And this is just going to be the normal Baker shader, not the animated one. We'll focus on the animated one later. So if you look here, the first option we have is the bake image texture name. You can set this to whatever we want, so I can set it to like monkey or something. Resolution is going to be the resolution of the baked image texture. Now 2048 is pretty big. 1024 is a pretty good medium usually. I'm just going to use 512 though for the sake of this tutorial. Actually, I guess let's do 1024. Let's do it. You'll also notice it's saying that the watercolor/charcoal effect can be baked. That's because it can't be baked, and neither can the crosshatch lighting effect be baked because they use things that are like internal in Blender and they use like parallax, so that's not something you can just represent in an image texture. Same with outlines. Like the object outline, for example, is a separate thing that doesn't have to do with the texture. So basically you'll see here you have this job needing to be performed thing, and it says bake specular reflection, bake ambient occlusion, bake diffuse lighting. The reason it says those things is because on this object we have a specular reflection here, and that's because on the object there's certain things that need to be baked beforehand before we do the final bake. It's very easy though. It'll tell you directly the things that you need to bake. So here, if we didn't have the specular reflection effect, for example, we wouldn't see this bake specular reflection here because we wouldn't have to do that. Same with the ambient occlusion and diffuse lighting. When it says bake diffuse lighting, what that corresponds to is the stylized 3D lighting main dynamic EV. You won't have to bake diffuse lighting for any of these lights, but for the stylized 3D lighting main, you will be baking it. So technically you could just hit start final bake and it'll do all of these three as well. So you could bake in one click if you want to. However, I think it's a bit better to just go one by one, and that'll just ensure that things don't crash or anything. So as I said, it'll tell you the things that you need to do very nicely here. If you don't see bake diffuse lighting, then that means you don't have to do it, but since the add-on recognizes that we added a stylized light dynamic here, it's saying, okay, you should bake the diffuse lighting. We can do these three in any order. I think I want to start with bake diffuse lighting, so let's do that. Let's click it. And one thing is you have to make sure that your model is unwrapped. That should have been done already while you were working, obviously. If you were doing like texture painting and stuff, your model would have already been unwrapped, but just in case it isn't, make sure it is. This monkey is unwrapped, so yeah. One other thing is, if you want, you don't have to do this, but I just like to do it. For the subdivision surface modifier that I added to the monkey, obviously you don't even need to have this at all, but when you bake it, then obviously it's going to be very blocky because that's what the model looks like, right? So I usually like to set my subdivision surface modifier to be somewhere like 3, just to make it smooth, you know? And now when we bake it, we're going to get this nice and smooth texture. One thing I want to say is make sure when you bake, you make the material / effects single user copy, so that this is the only object that we're baking onto, right? Because as you can see here, we have this other Suzanne that's using the same material, as is denoted by the 2 here. 2 objects are using the material, and the problem with that is if we bake with this monkey selected, it's going to bake the lighting of this one onto this one. And that's a problem because the lighting on this is different than the lighting on this. And so just as a general rule, I hope that's not too confusing, just hit this make material / effects single user copy when you want to bake something. And so now we're going to hit bake diffuse lighting. Okay, so it's done. Now if we go to our sun object, if we rotate around the lighting, you'll see it no more updates on our Suzanne. And the reason why is because now it's baked and it's finalized, I guess you can say. You can still edit things a little bit after you've baked the diffuse lighting. So if you go to the stylized light layer here, you'll notice you can still move around things. Like the tune steps, you can still play with that. The only thing you can't play around with anymore though is like the bump settings, and you can't play around with the sun location as well after you bake. Hey guys, one caveat for baking is if you have this painterly effect enabled on your stylized light dynamic, meaning like the stylized 3D lighting main dynamic, the painterly effect enabled on this, there's a chance that the bake might mess up a little bit. So what we do in order to counteract that is and once again, this is only if you have the enable painterly effect enabled. So you could go to the bake normals here and type in whatever you want to enable. I'll just call it like normals. And if we bake this, and then we go back to our stylized light layer, after you bake it, you can turn off the painterly effect, and then over here, enable normal map. Set normal map to be the whatever you just called your normal map to be. As you can see, there we have it. And then after you do this, you can go and bake your diffuse lighting. So if I bake it now, as you can see, it looks a little different to what we had before, but overall not bad. And also remember, if you want to adjust some things, you can adjust like the shadow value if it becomes too contrasted after you bake the lighting. And then once you do your final bake, all of this will look like this, and it'll be fine. Okay, so we also have to bake the specular reflection. When you're baking specular reflections, they'll go in the direction that the sun is. As you can see, Blender kind of moves around the reflections as we rotate our camera, and that's not something that you can just export. You know, we're exporting image textures so that they can be used in other softwares, and in order to do that, Blender has to bake it in one location. So, sorry if that's a bit confusing. I'm going to show you right now what I mean. We're going to hit bake specular reflection. So as you can see, it doesn't look too bad, but if you ever think that like, oh, I screwed up when it comes to baking, you can always go here, and if you scroll down, you can see you have an option here to unbake the diffuse lighting, as well as if we view the specular reflection effect, we have an unbake specular lighting here option too, if you messed up the bake. So for example, if I go back to our stylized light layer, and I hit the unbake diffuse lighting button, now our light updates now with the sun, which means now it's no longer baked. We've undid the bake that we did before. And if you look here now, as you can see, we have the bake diffuse lighting option here again because the add-on recognizes that, hey, we have to bake the diffuse lighting. So let's do that again, bake diffuse lighting. So that's good. Then the last thing, we just have to bake the ambient occlusion, so let's do that. So all of those bakes are now done. Now if you want, you can go into cycles, and you can see your tune shader is here perfectly. And that's something that's normally impossible in Blender, but through this method, through this add-on, you can actually do that. And it's really cool, right? Now at this phase, you can still edit whatever you want in your effects layers. So you can play around with the steps, the light strength and all that. Okay, anyways, so I'm gonna go back to Eevee for now because I like working in Eevee. And so now we have the start final bake option. And one thing I want to say is we can see down here the warning charcoal / watercolor number 1 is unbakeable, will be removed upon baking. That's because the watercolor / charcoal effect uses parallax and uses some like internal things that are only in Blender, so it can't really be exported. So it'll automatically be removed when we start the final bake. So now we can start the final bake. So I'll hit that. Alright, so now after the bake is done, we can hit the save and export monkey image textures. If you click this, you can click it as many times as you want. And in the same directory as where our blend file is, which this is called tutorial.blend, if you look down here, it'll be in the same directory. You'll have a textures folder that was just created. Obviously, I put this in my downloads folder, so it's kind of dumb. I mean, I should have made like a folder for this blend file first, because then everything would have been neatly organized. But basically, the point is, in the same directory as your blend file, you're going to have a textures folder created. If you look in here, you can see we have a monkey final. And you don't have to do that if you don't want to. You could also go to the UV editing tab, select the image that you want, and then hit Alt-S, or Alt-Shift-S, sorry, and then basically you can just save it wherever you want. So yeah, that's baking, and this is very non-destructive in the sense that if you want to change things and then bake again, you can very easily do it. Let's say I change like the texture overlay, for example, and I like move the location, then I can easily hit bake again, and it'll update. And after you bake again, remember to always hit the save and export monkey image textures, and it'll update in that folder. It's very non-destructive. So now I think it would be a good time to start talking about animation a bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add another effect so that we have more things to animate. I'm just going to I'll add like a stylized foam. And let's say maybe I wanted to animate it going like this. So what we could do is, if you go to your timeline, you can very easily just hit the I key on the location here. And what we want to do to animate things that we're using this add-on panel to animate is we want to go to what's called the graph editor. If you guys don't know what it is, I recommend watching like a basic video on how it works. I'll try to explain a little bit here, but basically if you go to the graph editor and you click on this arrow key here, which means selected only, by default it'll only show the keyframes that are associated with the selected object, but we want to be able to see everything, so I'm just going to click that to disable it. And as you can see now, you can see here Suzanne, our object, and then we have the name of the material. If you open this list, you can see we have these values that we animated. And to be honest, we didn't need to animate the Y or Z, so I'm just gonna right click that and delete single keyframe. So now all we have is the X default value. If you double click on a thing on the left side here, and then you hit A and then the period key on your numpad, you can zoom in on that curve. So as you can see, it starts at 0 here. Let's go forward in our timeline, maybe to like frame, I don't know, 25, and let's move the foam location this way a bit. Now we're gonna hit I again. So now, if you look, I'm gonna hit A and then the numpad key again. Now you can see there's an animation happening. And once again, I hit the I key, so it keyframed the Y and Z as well. I should have just used the insert single keyframe feature, but either way, it really doesn't matter. The point is, what we're focused on is the X location, so I'm just going to double click on the X and then hit Shift H so it hides all the other curves. So now we're just focusing on this one, and as you can see, it animates just like that, just as we want it to. If you want, you can select both of the keyframes and then hit the T key and hit linear, and now it'll be a linear interpolation rather than smooth in and smooth out. So yeah, as you can see, it's moving like that, and you can drag your points around however you want. And so now we have an animation that's actually happening. And so yeah, you can drag out the keyframes as you like to make it slower or faster. You might be wondering, how do we loop this? Looping is a bit weird in Blender. For this, if you want, you could select all of the keyframes and then hit Shift-D, make cyclic, which will make it basically just restart. But for something like what we're doing, where we're moving the actual location of the foam, what I prefer to do instead is just try to follow along with the logic that I'm going to use here. But basically what we can do is we can duplicate this foam effect. So I'm going to duplicate it, and I'll explain to you what I'm doing in a second. So as you can see, now we have 2 of them. What we can do is we can kind of blend between the original foam and the duplicate so that there's sort of a fade. So let me show you what I mean. First, I'm going to get rid of this cyclic modifier that I was showing you guys how to add. So I'm going to hit Shift-D and clear cyclic. But basically we want our stylized foam duplicate to have the same animation as the regular stylized foam. So let's view it real quick, and let's just animate it a bit. Okay, so what I'm doing here basically is I'm just making it so that the stylized foam duplicate has the same exact animation as the stylized foam original. So now as you can see, they're both animating in the same exact way. I'm gonna hide this Y and Z curves here because we don't need them once again. So now we just have the two X locations for each of the stylized foam effects. So one other thing I want to do is I want to double click on both of the X location curves. I'm going to hit Shift D and do linear extrapolation. What that'll do is it'll just make it so that the curve goes on forever rather than stopping. I'm going to do the same for this one here. Shift D, linear extrapolation. And now they both are just going to go on forever. What I'm going to do now is basically I'm going to keyframe the visibility of both of these. So I and I. As you can see, we have the nodes here for visibility. So I'm just going to give you guys a little bit of a briefing on what we're going to do next. So basically, we have our two X value curves. And obviously previously these two were on top of each other. Like it was like this before. But basically we want to take one of them and move them to the end of whenever our loop is. So I decided the end of our loop will be on frame 36. So basically you want to move one of the curves so that the first frame is on 36, because then with this we know that this keyframe here and this one here are exactly the same, because these two curves are the same animation, right? They're doing the same exact thing, and so we know that we're starting and ending on the same frame, right? And what we're going to do is while we're here animating and we're using this curve, we're going to have the visibility set so that, as you can see, while this curve is playing, the visibility is set to 1, meaning all of it can be seen. But then once we get to the end of our loop, the visibility goes to 0, so you can't see it anymore. And instead what happens is we bring up the visibility of this curve. So you see this blue curve here, if I expand it a bit, you can see that this is the visibility of this second curve here, and this curve here is the visibility of the first one, right? So you can see we're switching between the visibilities so that by the end of it, we're now viewing this second curve. And that works because then the last frame is the same as the first, and it can just loop again, right? So if I play that, as you can see now, it blends very nicely. Sorry if it's a bit confusing, I know it can be hard to explain, but try doing it yourself and then watch this back again and you'll understand it. And what I'm doing here is I'm selecting the visibility for the duplicate and I'm dragging it down to 0. So I've dragged it down to 0 so that it's not even visible at all. And what we essentially want to happen is we want these two to blend so that by the time they're done blending, we get back to what would be the original keyframe. So as you can see now, frame 36 and frame 0 are the exact same thing. So if we were to export this, you can see it's a loop. Let's isolate these two visibility curves. I'm going to select them at Shift H, so we're just looking at them. And we can obviously play around with this. We can make it happen quicker or faster if that's what we want. So if we do it like this, now it'll blend really quickly just like that. And yeah, so now all we would have to do is export frame 0 through 36 and it would be a loop. Anyways, once you're satisfied, you can go up and go to the Bake Your Shader Animated tab. We're going to call our bake image texture name monkey-animated, and resolution I'm going to keep at 1024. You'll notice for Bake Your Shader Animated, there's no section where it says jobs to be performed and then it says bake specular, bake diffuse light, bake ambient occlusion. That's because for Bake Your Shader Animated, it kind of like automates the process for all of that, and it'll do it all internally, so it's pretty nice. For start frame, obviously this is just going to be the start frame where you want your animation to begin. Oh yeah, I also animated the sunlight actually as well, just to give more variety to the animation that we're making here. So as you can see, I have the sunlight selected, and I basically just animated the rotation of it going around a bit, but that is besides the point. So yeah, so our loop goes from 0 to 36, right? Or our animation, or you don't necessarily have to make a loop, it's up to you, you can make whatever you want. So 0 to 36, now you'll see these checkboxes here, animated diffuse light and animated specular reflection. What these are is, most of the time you'll have this unchecked, but in this situation, we'll have to check both of them, because the reason why is basically what animated diffuse light means is the stylized light dynamic, meaning this effect up here, this first effect, stylized 3D lighting main dynamic EV. are we animating that at all? Which we are here, and the reason why is because since I have the sunlight animated, as you can see the sunlight is animating, that's associated with the Stylized Light Dynamic main effect. So basically if you have like the sun moving or like a point light moving and it's animated, you're going to want to check this box. And also if you animate any of the parameters in the Stylized Light Dynamic effect under like bump settings, anything like under bump settings and downwards, you're going to want to check this animated diffuse light button. So obviously we have our sun animating here, which is why I checked it. And if we animated any of these parameters, I should also check it as well. Basically doing this just ensures that the light gets animated as well. So yeah, animated specular reflection, same exact thing. Obviously since our light is moving, you can see the specular reflections are changing position as well, the white highlights. So in order for that to show up in our animation, we want to check animated specular reflection. So yeah, and also if we look at our specular reflection effect layer, if you animate any of the effects that are underneath like the bump part until the end of it, if you animate like any of these effects like strength, you're going to want to check this box as well. So yeah, most of the time you won't be using this, but if you're animating like light for whatever reason, then yeah, you're going to want to have these checked off. Okay, processing speed is basically, you can think of it like it's how much time Blender will take a break between baking each frame. I have a good computer, so I like to keep this low at like 4 seconds. That's what it is. 4.0 means 4 seconds. If you have a bad computer, maybe you want to put it to like 20 or something like that. But I think honestly most machines 4 should work something between like 4 to 10. So I just use 4. And so we could hit the start final bake and it'll bake frames 0 to 36, but for those of you who have a worse computer, it might be better to just bake like frame 0 to 5 first, and then after that finishes you can type in like 6 to 10. After that's done, you can do like 11 to 15, and understand that this is very like procedural and dynamic in the sense that it's non-destructive, meaning if we want to rebake like frames 3 to 8 of the animation, we could do that and then export it, and it'll only affect frames 3 to 8. So it's really flexible. You can just bake whatever frames you want, and the add-on will remember that like, okay, you're referring to frames 3 to 8, and I'll only update frames 3 to 8 when you hit the save and export button. So yeah, if you ever mess anything up in baking your animation, you can always go back and redo it, or go back and fix any parameters that you want to change and then bake it again, and it'll be perfectly done. So just to show you guys, I'll do like frames 0 to 10 first, for example, just for those of you who might not have the best PC. So I'm going to save just in case anything happens, and yeah, I'm going to hit start final bake. Alright, so baking those 11 frames 0 to 10 just finished. So the thing is, actually, using the animated diffuse light and animated specular reflection features, they do increase the complexity of the bake, making it take longer. Like it took maybe 6 minutes to bake those 11 frames. If we go here to the UV editing tab, you can see now you have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And so basically if we didn't have these checked, if we were like doing an animation without animating the diffuse light or the specular reflections, it would have only took like 2 minutes actually, which is pretty crazy. But having both of these checked increases the complexity a little bit. And obviously if we only had like one of them checked, it would have taken like 4 minutes instead of 6 minutes. But yeah, obviously still really good. Anyways, at any point you can hit the save and export image textures feature. And then if I go to my folder where my blend file is saved, which here it's called tutorial autosave, that's the file I'm on currently, we can look at the textures. So if we pull up our textures folder, which is going to be once again in the same directory as your file that you're currently working in, you can see now frames 0 to 10 have been exported here. So yeah, that's pretty cool. So now I'm going to just export the rest. I'm going to do like 11 to 36. And finish it off here. But yeah, if you guys have a worse computer, you might want to do it in like lesser incrementations. Alright, so that finished. Took about like 10 minutes, maybe a little more. So if I go to my textures folder, or first let me just save and export the textures. So I'm going to click the save and export monkey animated image textures. We go to our folder now. As you can see, it updates and all of them are here. So if we double click on the frame, and if you use your arrow keys, you can see it's animating. So what we do to actually be able to export this and, you know, use it as something is we can go into like After Effects and put it all together and export it as either a GIF or an MP4 file. Okay, so I decided for those of you who do use After Effects, I'll just show you how to do it here. It's really easy. Obviously you can use whatever video editing software you want. It doesn't have to be After Effects, but After Effects is just really nice to use for this. If you double click here, you can select all of your frames. So just select frame 0 to 36. Check this PNG sequence feature. Hit import, and then you can drag this down here, whoops, to the timeline. It's animating, and look at that, it's a cool loop. So now that we have this here, all we have to do is go to File, Export, Add to Render Queue, and once we're here, just check this. Oh, whoops, first we have to put our output destination, so I'll set it to my desktop or downloads folder or something. monkey image texture animated, and once you're done, just hit render. So if I go to files now, as you can see, we have it right, and there we go, we have a MP4 that we can now use. So at this point you're basically done. You could export your model and use this animated image texture that we made as the texture for it, and yeah, you'll have your completely animated model exported. Just to show you guys that it actually worked, if you go to edit, preferences, type in images as planes, make sure you have this add-on enabled. It's a free add-on that comes with Blender. So if I hit Shift A, images as planes, you can then select the MP4 file or whatever file format you used, and you'll see you'll get this plane here. So just to show you guys that it actually is working, I'll make a new material here and get rid of this principal BSTF. I'll add an image texture, and if you copy over this image texture from the image plane that we just imported, just copy the node, paste it here for the monkey material, and connect it to the output. As you can see, there we have it. The whole thing has worked beautifully. And if we go back to our timeline and we hit play, as you can see, there it is. So obviously if you're exporting this to like some other software like Unity or Unreal Engine, I'm sure there's a way to loop it there. If not, I mean, you can literally just have this animation keep on playing over and over again. Since it's a loop, and if you didn't make a loop, then you don't even have to worry about that. But yeah, in Blender here you can hit this cyclic thing and it'll keep on animating forever. So yeah, that's just really awesome. Alright guys, so one other thing is I want to talk to you about if you're baking and you're using transparency, you could also bake that too. So if you see here when we go to the Bake Your Shader tab, if you have a transparent dynamic texture, which is the effect that lets us add transparency to our model, you'll see you have this Bake Alpha transparency there as well, and if you click that, it's going to bake the black and white alpha map for our object. So I also made a little bit of an animation here just to show you guys that you can bake and export animated transparency as well. So if we go to the Bake Your Shader animated, it does it automatically. So if I'm just for the sake of this, I'm going to put the resolution really low so that it computes quickly, and I'll do like frame 0 to, or let's just choose like, let's go from like 5. So I'll just animate like this little thing right here. Processing speed I'll set to like 4, and I'm just going to call this transparent test. So I'm going to hit start final bake. Alright, so the bake finished, and now obviously you can hit the save and export transparent test image textures and it'll export those 5 to 20. And just to prove to you that this all worked well, if I go to the UV editing tab, get rid of this, and I go to the images and I type in transparent test, as you can see now we have both the frames for the texture, which was just blue obviously because the model is all just blue. And so if you scroll down a bit, you can see right here we have transparent test frames 5 to 20. I'm just going to go to the shader editor to show you guys the proof that this actually is completely good. Add an image texture, plug it in just to show you guys. So there it is. You can see that is what the mask is. White stands for transparent obviously, and then black is non-transparent. So if I toggle between these two, oops, we're on the wrong frame. This is frame 5, so let me go to frame 5 on my timeline. Alright, so there you have it. As you can see, it's the same exact thing. And then if we go to like frame, I don't know, let's go to like frame 9 just as an example, and then let's go to our timeline, set it to frame 9, and as you can see, still same exact thing. So yeah, you can have animated transparency. You would just export the alphas as an image sequence to After Effects or whatever video software you use, like I showed you before, and then you would use that as the mask. Yeah, it's pretty dope. Obviously it's really blurry because I set it to 512 here just for this tutorial so that it goes really quickly, but if I did like 1024 it would be way higher res. Okay, so right now for example I rebaked it at 1024, and you can see now for this frame that I'm looking at, frame 9, you can see it's way less blurry. Alright, now that we're done with that, what I want to talk about is a few more effects that we got. And so these effects are going to be the fog, steam, and Godray effect. They're very easy to understand. You don't really have to think much with them at all. So if I select add a fog object and hit add effect, as you can see it spawns somewhere up here. I might change the spawn location, but either way you'll see in your objects here, if you type in fog, you'll see we have our fog here, and you can just select it. You can move it wherever you want, and it's completely customizable. So as you can see here on the right hand side of the screen, you can change the scale it in whatever direction we want. We can change the clamping, the matte color, and if you want to animate it, you got your mask location as well. You can animate it up like that if you want. By the time the add-on's released, you're probably going to see a distort feature too for the mask for the noise, so yeah, that's probably going to be there. Okay, so as you can see here, I added it. I should also say that for animating the fog like this, you should also try and animate the fog Z location, and you'll see I changed around the stuff a little here. I also added like a detail thing and a lacularity thing if you guys want to play around with that. But basically, the reason it's cool to animate the Z as well while you're animating the fog go up is because it kind of like breaks it up a bit and it makes it a lot less static. So that's how you're able to get something that's like a lot smoother. But anyways, yeah, the real powerful thing about this is that you can duplicate them around and create kind of like these cascading fog sheets that, like, if you're doing like an environment or something, this could be like really helpful. You'll notice that if we, move the location on one or any of these parameters on one, it moves it on all of them. And you might not want that, right? So you can hit the make material / effects single user copy for any of these. So if I do it for this one in the back here, you can see now when I move it or scale it or anything, it doesn't affect the others anymore. It only affects itself. So yeah, that's just something that's, I think, is really cool. And yeah, you can play around with this and all of it is just very customizable for you guys. And yeah, so let's talk about another effect now. To add these effects, you need to be clicked on an object that has the Stylized shader enabled. So if we go back here, we have our menu. Let's add the Steam object. What this is it's kind of like a Steam object. If I hit play, let me just increase the timeline. If I hit play, you can see by default it is animating. You have all these parameters you can use. If you want to change the animation or anything like that, obviously, you have the keyframes here in the timeline, and you can always adjust like what you want the speed to be. If I go to the graph editor, for example, and as you can see, SB Steam, Shader Builder Steam, let's just select these 3 curves and then hit Shift H to hide everything else. Then I'm going to hit A and then period, so we just see this. And so yeah, if you want to make it faster or slower, you can just move these points around like that, or if you wanted to, you could have just completely deleted the keyframes here and reanimated them yourself. So you have that. You can change the scale in whatever direction you want. Steam fade is like where it fades at. Detail, which is associated with roughness, so now there's like more detail. I think it looks pretty nice with more detail. But yeah, then there's spreading, and then there's the bottom, which kind of just determines the overall transparency of it. So yeah, that's how that works. And as you can see, I like to scale them out as well. So like, for example, if I hit SZ, you can really scale them high like that. I'm just gonna get rid of these Steam objects. They also have empties associated with them. If I type in Steam, you can see Steam Displace. I'm going to hit X to delete it. And then lastly, we have the Godray effect. If we add that, you'll see what it can do. As you can see, it just gives us a ray. And the real power in this is that we can duplicate it around and just add a lot of customization. So by duplicating it around like this, as you can see, I'm getting these rays. And you can scale them in X like that. So that you can vary like how big the rays are if you want some. And so you get this Godray effect that you can easily manipulate and do whatever the heck that you want. There's this animate feature here which allows you to animate the rays if you want. So if I go to frame 0 and I set I, go forward, increase it, and set I again. Set this to linear. As you can see, it's a bit slow. So let me increase that. Yeah. I'm gonna shift to linear extrapolation. But yeah, as you can see now, the God rays are like animating. Animation seed, it's just going to give us a different animation. So if I change the seed to like 12, as you can see now, the God rays animate a bit differently in terms of like which one is fading in and fading out. You can set it to whatever color you like. Maybe let's give it a bright color. And delay between fades is, you don't really have to use this feature to be honest, but what it does is if I increase it, it'll slightly delay the fade in and fade out effect for each God ray object. There's also this top fade feature and the bottom fade. Bottom fade is like where it ends, and top fade is where the top ends. So if you want to hide it at the top, you can do that too. To decrease like blurriness and stuff, what I like to do is break it up by adding like really thin rays like here, like I'm doing, and that kind of gives it a bit more character. Just have some that are really thin and some that are really thick. Like this one in the background is very thick, and the point is to just kind of break them up like that. Alright guys, one other thing that I added to the Godray effect, or two other things actually, is one, there's beam detail here, which if you enable it, you can see we kind of get a bit more detail in our streaks, in our beams, so you could use that if you want. One other thing I added is to enable dust particles here, so if you enable it, you can see we get these dust particles showing up. If you change the scale, you can make it bigger or smaller. I like to keep it smaller generally. And you can use the particle size parameter here too. And over here you have the location, which you can animate as well. And you can make it go like down or up, or just kind of like cycle. So yeah, that's just a pretty cool thing. If you want to use it, you can. You should also move these rays in front of the cube like this. Yeah, it's a lot better. Lastly, we also have this thing down here where it says change background color. So if you click that, you won't notice anything immediately, but basically what it lets us do is it lets us change the background. So if we scroll down, if we switch our base color, you can see you can switch it to whatever you want. If you want it to be like more white or something like that, you would do that. And as you can see, we have gradient settings here, and what this is if we increase the top value, and if we like decrease the bottom value, you can see now if you look up, it becomes a stepped gradient. And of course, this should be very familiar to you at this point. We have style here with stepped linear, so you can have more steps if you want, or you can just use a completely linear one if that's what you want as well. So I'm going to leave it at step for now because I think it's pretty interesting. And then, yeah, so if you want, you could colorize the top as well. So if I want the top to be like more red, then I could put red here and then drag up this influence thing, which will make the top more red. Same thing with the bottom. If you want to colorize it, you can colorize it as well. After that, we have gradient location, so you can shift it if you want. Then obviously there's like rotation too, if you want to rotate it. Scale, as you can see, that's what it does. Then we have painterly distort, which allows you to distort the gradient, and you know, you could use scale. You can distort it in like whatever axis you want. So if you want it to be like that, you could do that. And yeah. So it's up to you what you want to do here. So yeah, that's just a neat tool if you want to add a background to your scene. Alright guys, so now what I'm going to do is just show you the brushes that come with this add-on. So if I add a texture paint effect, and obviously I'm just going to make a new image texture here, you can see the texture paint effect timestamp in this video if you want to know more about what that. But basically, you can go into texture paint mode and you can select from any of these brushes. So first off, I'm going to select the gouache brush because it's my favorite, and I'm just showing you here how it works a bit. It has a bit of a nice texture, and yeah, so you can just paint as you want with it. One thing you should know when painting with these brushes is you really should have pen pressure or like a pen tablet in order to use them properly. Some of them require pen pressure to work properly, so yeah, it's important that you have that. Some of them don't require pen pressure, but it's just like way better if you have pen pressure, so I really highly recommend you have a tablet. Yeah, there's not much for me to really say here. All I can say is play around with them obviously, and you'll be able to make some pretty cool things. The size of the brush matters as well as like how close you are to the object, so do take that into account as well. But yeah, there's not much else for me to really say here, so I'm just going to keep it time-lapse, and maybe I'll say some things if I need to at any time period. And yeah, once again, if you're new to texture painting, remember you can use Shift F to adjust the brush strength, and you use F to adjust the brush size. Over here for the dust brush, I recommend just using your mouse, because if you use your pen, it's not going to be constant. Then finally over here, what we have is this painterly smudge effect. You have to go to the smudge tool in order to see it though. So make sure you're on the smudge tool on the left hand side of the screen. You can see I have the fingertip thing selected. Anyways guys, thanks for watching. I hope you guys can find this very valuable. Have a great day.